I wonder if they have any plans to stuff the last blonde couple and put them in a museum along with a dodo bird and a pot of sauce.
I've been exploring the American alt-right. This is the second of a two-part video which looks at white nationalism. In part one, we saw how beliefs about racial segregation have been kept alive in America, and we met America's leading segregationist, Jared Taylor, who believes that white people should form a new state where black and white people do not mix. This part examines the white nationalist desire for a homeland and ideas circulating among the American far right for establishing one. These ideas are fueled by dark fantasies of a race war and fears of persecution and eventual extinction of white people. The last video finished with Dylan Roof, who killed 9 black churchgoers in South Carolina. Roof regarded what he did as an act of war to restore Southern Confederate pride.
Just be able to like reinstate segregation or something like that, you know, without there having to be a race war. But, you know, there probably will be a race war eventually.
But just segregation, right? I mean, it's all.
I mean, that would be okay with me for right now, but like I said, you know, that's sort of unrealistic. You know, that black people aren't just going to let themselves, you know, go back into segregation.
Roof wanted black people to be driven out of the state he grew up in, rather than relocate himself to northwestern America to form a new white homeland. In Roof's manifesto, he refers to something called the Northwest Front. There is a small genre of books read by people in the far right which fictionalizes the collapse of white civilization. The most notorious work in the, for want of a better term, race war genre is the Turner Diaries, which the FBI found in the possession of the terrorist Timothy McVeigh in 1996. The neo-Nazi William Pierce wrote the Turner Diaries under a pseudonym, from the perspective of a guerrilla soldier at war with a federal government run by blacks and Jews. His organization takes over California, seizing its nuclear arsenal, ethnically cleansing the state, and publicly hanging race traitors. This is bleak, hardline, exterminationist Nazi stuff, and has for decades been required reading within the more militant fringes of the far right, treated almost like a religious text. There is also the French novel, The Camp of the Saints, which White House strategist Steve Bannon has cited on several occasions. A book in which Europe gets swamped with hordes of brown immigrants who outnumber the white people, and the Queen of England must, horror of all horrors, marry her son to a Pakistani woman. Harold Covington is the most prolific author in this genre. He's authored the Northwest Independence series, which is escapist fiction laying a template for white revolution and the establishment of a racially pure society in the Northwest American states of Idaho, Washington, and Oregon. The Northwest Independence series has refined the Turner Diaries for the politics of the new millennium, in which the enemy is a politically correct federal government that has allowed uncontrolled immigration and legalized the killing of the elderly, prompting white working-class people to take up arms. Covington's books have been read widely amongst the far right and appeal to both white nationalists and those in America's anti-government militia movement.
The feds had to bend down and look closely to see where the back of her head had been blown away. "That's Melanie Young," said one of the officers, a young white man who took off his helmet to reveal a military buzz cut. "I recognize her from the file photos." The black major laughed aloud in pure joy and viciously kicked the dead girl's body once, twice, 3 times. "Is that really necessary, sir?" demanded the young white officer. "Got a problem with a brother dissing white woman, Mac? Maybe you want I should tap dance to shuffle a bit on the poor dead missy. You want a little session with internal affairs down at the Homeland Security lockup in Bremerton, Mr. McBride?" snarled the major. "No, sir," replied McBride, woodenly. "Then shut your mouth. I want to kick this bitch in her dead racist ass. I kicked the bitch."
You get the idea. Covington is a colourful character. He lived in Zimbabwe, or Rhodesia as it was known, before being deported for attempting to establish a neo-Nazi political party there. He ran the American National Socialist Party and was present at the Greensboro massacre, where 5 people were killed while protesting a Klan rally. Covington wants his books to be regarded as prophecy, and he's blurring the line between fiction and reality by establishing an organization to promote migration of white nationalists to the Pacific Northwest.
We are based on a central primary act, immigration here to the Pacific Northwest, to the homeland. With all these other outfits, you get involved with them through something that you say. You get involved with us through something that you do. Eventually, the United States of America is going to break up like the old Soviet Union did, and the white man is going to have to grab back a piece of the pie. Now, we have a plan to create here in the Northwest what some right-wing and racial groups call a white ethno-state. It is a solid, fairly detailed plan. We even have our own draft constitution. Yes, we dare to say that we are better than the other alternatives in the white nationalist movement because we are right.
Opinions of Covington are divided amongst the far right, with some dismissing him as a bit of an oddball, while others believe he's the only person who has laid out a viable plan for a white homeland in America. The northwestern states have a very small black population, and it's not for nothing that the black community of Oregon in particular stands at just 2% of that state's population. As it happens, Oregon was a white homeland. Oregon has always been the magnet for people trying to establish utopian communities. The entire state was founded to be a purely white society, which in the 1800s was considered a progressive kind of thing to do. Oregon didn't have slavery because black people were not allowed to live there at all, and it was written in Oregon's state constitution that the penalty for a black person lingering in the state was a whipping. Oregon amended this aspect of their constitution in the 1920s, but not before electing a Klan governor. Here's the mayor of Portland and the chief of police hanging around with some of their friends. Oregon didn't ratify the 14th Amendment, which provides equal protection under the law, until 1973. And there's a good documentary that was made in 1991 called Local Color, in which the people from Oregon's black community share their experiences of this era.
Some of the towns had signs. Do not let the sun catch you. You couldn't stay in town overnight. Throughout Eastern Oregon, Southern Oregon, you were refused service in most of the restaurants. You could not stay in the motels. So when you travel across the state, then you either slept in your car, took a little bit of time off the side of the road and slept in your car, or kept driving on through. You gas up and drive on through till you got to somebody's house. And these words were passed on through the years. Well, you can stay at the Torrances, they'll let you stay overnight. Or you can stay at the Smiths in Baker, they'll keep you.
On the playground, I played alone. The other girls played jump rope. The other girls played jacks. My mother bought me a ball and jacks, and I sat in a corner and I played by myself. And that's hard. I didn't know until later that we were there the same year that the Coos Bay area, they had hanged a black man, lynched him within that same period of time. And that was the reason for a intense way of treating me at a distance.
It wasn't until the Second World War when black people arrived in Oregon in significant numbers to work in Portland shipping yards. And even then, the trade unions barred them from the good jobs. And to this day, Oregon still has some issues with its race relations. In the 1980s, the neo-Nazi Richard Gerndt Butler recognized this history and began promoting the idea of a Northwestern Republic to the militant factions of the American far right. Butler's plan forms the basis of Harold Covington's novels. Covington characterizes his struggle for territorial separatism as a colonial war. And the American far right understands that to colonize a territory, simply inhabiting it isn't enough. Political supremacy is also required, and most crucially, the transfer of land and resources into private hands. While I was making another video, I came across this photo. It's a flag of the South African paramilitary group called the Avebeer. I sort of laughed it off, but I've since learned that South Africa is a hobby horse of the American far right. They consider the apartheid system as the gold standard in managing race relations, and imagine that America will resemble post-apartheid South Africa in a future where whites become a minority.
What are those patches right there?
No, well, that's the old South African flag, and that's the Rhodesian flag.
Of all the patches you could have chose, why'd you choose those two patches?
Well, because they represent white people ruling in the homeland of Africans and ruling as minorities. You know?
Ruling as minorities?
Yeah, that's powerful.
The Golden City, South Africa's Johannesburg. 70 years have brought a small township to rank with the world's richest cities, and it's still growing fast. A center of gold mining, of industry and commerce, Johannesburg creates enormous wealth.
While the rest of Africa began looking towards decolonization and the American South was about to racially integrate, the South African government began strictly reasserting white racial dominance. Apartheid was a product of Afrikaner nationalism and conceived in response to the so-called native question concerning black people migrating into cities for work during the Second World War. The South African government studied the American Jim Crow South and formalised much of it within their own laws. Apartheid's architect, Henry Verwoerd, liked to call the system separate development, a variation on the American separate but equal doctrine. Here is Verwoerd in 1961, rationalising South Africa's very explicit form of racial domination.
We seek the gradual development of each of our groups in a certain direction. Here the solution is sought by openly retaining the white man's guiding hand, which elsewhere is the hidden guarantee of industrial development and even good administration.
Under apartheid, millions of people were displaced, purely on the basis of their skin colour, forcibly moved into 10 Bantustans or homelands, which were overcrowded rural slums. White ethnicities comprised roughly 20% of the South African population, and parceling off non-white communities would achieve demographic supremacy. People of colour were not allowed to leave their designated homeland without permission, and they were required to carry passbooks which contained employers' reports on their behaviour. If they worked in a city, they were made to live in ring-fenced townships and were not allowed out after dark. At its heart, apartheid was an economic system, providing the means to efficiently deploy and then discard cheap black labour for work in farms, mines and domestic settings. It ensured that race and class became perfectly aligned, and the role of the state became to enforce what was believed at the time to be a natural racial order. It could only be sustained with a police state. Nelson Mandela emerged from prison as a committed non-racialist. His vision was of a new South Africa that would belong to those who lived there and built on partnership, not domination. Mandela took the high road and pursued a negotiated settlement and reconciliation in the place of armed conflict. But some white South Africans weren't having it. The Arbeer was a far-right Afrikaner group led by Eugene Terblanche.
Een ding moet die wêreld daar buitekant weet. Ons kan nie sonder vryheid lewe en as dit dan moet, dan sal ons hom vat met die geweld van het werk.
It represented a tendency in rural South Africa who stood to gain the least out of democracy. When negotiations opened between the ruling National Party and Mandela's ANC, Terblanche began agitating for a white Afrikaner homeland and threatened all-out civil war to achieve it. Leading up to the 1994 elections, South Africa was on a knife edge. An Arbeer member assassinated the communist leader Chris Hani, a man whose stature amongst black South Africans was surpassed only by Madiba himself. On the eve of the election, the Arbeer invaded the Bophuthatswana homeland. They massacred dozens of unsuspecting people.
On the way to go and fetch my text, Maragota, the AWB just shoot us.
The Arbeer were driven out by local police, but not before a carload of them were forced off the road, right in front of news media, including the famed photographer Kevin Carter. It's devastating footage to watch. In one breath, this paramilitary is cursing the police with racial epithets, demanding an ambulance, and in the next breath he's pleading for his own life. The Arbeer paramilitaries were summarily executed, and images were plastered across the South African and world media. Dozens of people had died that day. However, this event is marked by many South Africans as the moment their world became punctured with the realization that in the new South Africa, white people's lives were no longer sacrosanct. And that is when murmurings began of an impending white genocide. We'll return to America in a moment, but first we'll take a flyover of post-apartheid South Africa. The apartheid era more or less coincided with the Cold War. Mandela was unapologetic about his support for those who had supported the ANC during their struggle. There were grave fears among white South Africans that majority rule would mean a communist takeover. However, Mandela was a pragmatist and prioritized stability.
The tiny minority of whites that was in power in this country and that oppressed us were not free. They were seized by fear. And they were insecure. They did not know what changes would mean as far as their living conditions are concerned. Would they be able to maintain these privileges which have enriched their lives? It was natural. And any freedom fighter who was now looking beyond the mere liberation had to consider the interests of the minorities as well. The basic concern, of course, was the living conditions of the black majority that had struggled. We have brought about liberation in order to address their basic needs first and foremost. But at the same time, we have been denied the educational opportunities. We have no people with real knowledge and skills and expertise. The white minority, because of the historical situation, have those skills. We had to ensure that they remain in the country and to help us to build the new South Africa.
Neoliberal financial policies like deregulation and the privatization of state assets brought confidence to South African business and attracted foreign investment, which was sorely needed after decades of crippling sanctions. South Africa is a middle-income nation, but apartheid-era economic inequality has refused to budge. White people on average earn 6 times that of their black compatriots, and 80% of land in South Africa is privately owned by a minority of white people. South Africa was hit hard by the global financial crisis, and white squatter camps began to appear, which were unthinkable 20 years previously. Violent crime is an issue for everyone in the new South Africa, and life in rural South Africa is very short. The rural murder rate is affecting white farmers. Eugene Terblanche, who we saw earlier, was bludgeoned to death by 2 of his farm workers in 2010. The ANC has been mired in corruption and has done little to improve citizens' lives. If all you've heard about the new South Africa is the corruption and the violence, then you've probably missed the other big story that is unfolding right this very minute, and that is the resurgent left wing and South Africa's impending political realignment. Julius Malema is a radical firebrand, and his party, the EFF, has forced the issue of land reform into the national agenda.
The multinational and capitalists come and milk our resources, exploit our resources, and leave this continent without anything. So we do not agree. So a solution, which is very clear in the hands of the EFF, is that we need the expropriation of land without compensation. And people say that is extreme, that is unacceptable. Land was taken through black genocide. We're not talking white genocide. We're talking legislation passed through parliament, democratic parliament, which will say the state is the owner of the land and the land shall be allocated to people who have indicated clearly what they want to do with this land. And whether what they want to do, it is in the public interest and purpose.
Malema's populism is forcing the ANC to tack left to keep its grip on the National Assembly. And there are fears that Zuma is becoming like Robert Mugabe, who tanked the Zimbabwe economy and confiscated white land out of political desperation. And this has been fueling the nightmares of a vocal minority of white South Africans. They just want to return to a very recent era where things simply worked for them.
There's a certain amount of people which wants to create a nation of unity. And then there's us, the Boers. We don't take part in this, and we're not going to. And we're not going to go away. and we're the rightful owners of this land. So,
help me understand something. If we're going to live in the same country, but you don't want unity, how do we do it?
we never wanted unity.
No, I accept what you're saying.
Okay.
I accept that. That's what you said. What I'm saying is, then how do we live in one country?
Oh, that's very easy, okay? We can live in this country happily if we have proper borders. So if the Boers have their land, and the Tswanas have their land, and the Zulus have their land, we do not want to mix. Leave Joburg for the cosmopolitans and all this type like
Sounds like apartheid, though.
Yeah, properly, yes.
Okay, all right. Let me hear what my panelists have to say.
Two prominent apartheid deniers are the singer Steve Hofmeyr and the writer Dan Root. Hofmeyr and his Red October movement raise awareness for what they regard as oppression against Afrikaners.
What if there's a certain element of self-victimization? No, self-victimization means you go to your own farm and kill yourself. No, it means that you don't look at the actual statistics, because the statistics show that whites are safer than blacks in South Africa. No, those are the statistics. That's the Afro-Czech statistics. We've got different statistics to that, and we will give you the shortcuts to those if you want to read them. We don't care if genocide for you means that a lot of people have to die. There are other items in genocide, which is the vandalization of cultures, the suppression of cultures, taking away the mother tongue languages. All those things count for us as well. Let me tell you what we are sure about. Immaterial of the statistics. We are not used to this mortality rate. We are not used to being raped at this rate. And most importantly, we are not used to being raped by other cultures, tribes, ethnicities.
While poor South Africans fight for access to affordable university tuition, Hofmeyr campaigns against those same universities teaching in English rather than Afrikaans, something he ascribes to cultural suppression of his people. Their alarmist rhetoric comes from the distress of coming to terms of being ordinary citizens. It makes them a target of derision within contemporary South Africa.
And they have the nerve to call Nelson Mandela the father of the nation. How many kids did he have? 6! I could do that in a slow weekend in Kroonstad. I'm the f***ing father of the nation, damn it.
The poor nation would...
Exactly. I'm rebuilding the poor nation one day at a time, one pomp at a time. When my peel grows, so does our people.
Yeah, it's a tough job, but someone got to do it.
I'm making so many pure boere with my dick that someday soon we'll be able to rise up.
Daddy?
And... Huh?
Mommy says I should give you this.
Huh?
Happy Father's Day, Daddy.
Shit, I remember this one. How did you get past the Dobermans?
And there's another thing. Folk religion plays a bit of a role of their perceptions of reality out there in rural South Africa.
He foretold that a black touwleiertjie. A touwleiertjie is the boy or the man who walks at the head of the cattle when it tows the wagon across the plains. And he said that a black touwleiertjie would emerge. This leader would take the cattle in an easterly direction.
Long story short, they believe white people being genocided from the African continent was prophesied 100 years ago by a kind of a Boer Nostradamus figure. Maybe I'll make another video about this because it's just so fascinating. South Africa and America are both countries with very complicated histories, and so any comparisons we make will always be limited. Nonetheless, the American far right put on a warm reception for their South African counterparts.
Our next speaker, Dan Root, speaks from a perspective that will be ours if we do nothing. That is to say, Dan Root is from South Africa, so he is a white minority living under black rule.
Now, most of you are familiar with this pejorative term, apartheid, and there's a famous definition by the UN of it as well. But in fact, if you look at that UN definition, it fits the current government of South Africa more than it did any of our governments in the past, because the UN says apartheid is destroying a race or a culture or a people, and that's exactly what is being done to us currently in our own country, where we are a minority.
White genocide has become a grand meme in the American far right, which has been used to bolster their arguments for a racially pure homeland. Jared Taylor doesn't think there'll be a race war if society ever collapsed. I wonder though if on some level he understands the implications he makes in this statement about the relationship between deprivation and violence.
Somehow the notion that out of the rubble is going to spring forth this fully grown racial solidarity and that whites are going, my brother white, you know. I think when there's blood in the streets and the power's cut off, I'm not convinced that whites aren't going to be shooting each other as much as they're shooting anybody else.
Taylor's solution is one where white people organically form enclaves, something he calls the Orania model. He takes inspiration from a whites-only settlement of around 1,000 people, Orania, built on private land in South Africa. In 2011, Taylor gave a speech laying out his vision in which white nationalists would govern a small American town, which would attract racially aware white people from across the nation.
So I think a community of this kind in which a small number of activists could arrive in some small white community and get themselves voted to the city council, get themselves voted to the school board. I don't think it would take a huge number, a small activist minority, especially if it were a place where the population already was more or less sympathetic to us. I think certain achievements could be made. And once this community got some sort of reputation as being one that welcomes whites, with a school board, has a pro-white sort of attitude, the non-whites wouldn't really want to come. Very few people want to be test cases. They don't really want to buck the system. They don't want to be where they're not welcome. And of course they would think that they'd be surrounded by gun-toting crazy white people who would make life impossible for them. Some of you will complain, this is much too small. This is just terribly unambitious. I want to take our country back. Well, believe me, I want to take our country back just as much as any of you. But that is, for now, I'm afraid, an empty slogan. It's not a practical matter. We have to do the things that we're capable of doing.
In 2013, the neo-Nazi Craig Cobb felt so inspired to try this. Cobb purchased sections of land in the town of Leith in North Dakota and began gifting them to leaders of the white nationalist movement.
Well-known white supremacist Craig Cobb plans to turn Leith into a white nationalist community.
It would be extraordinarily beautiful when people enter the town because we will have flood-lit flags of all of the formerly white nations of Europe.
Cobb says like-minded people with white nationalist organizations will be taking up residence on his properties, so they'll have the majority of votes to take over the town.
What we're trying to do is move people into an area where they can get jobs at $50,000 a year almost immediately.
Cobb has a plan that, as crazy as it sounds, might actually happen.
He purchased one parcel and another parcel, and he finally got up to 12 to 13 parcels of land. He had the whole town mapped out as to what he was going to build on each piece of land that he owns, and after I see the map, it's very scary.
Here we can gather together and become a simple majority by legal electoral rights within the United States, and to have many young women who are the mates of young males in monogamous relationships pregnant, because pregnancy is a sign of confidence.
Where does all that hate come from?
You know, we hate that which threatens that which we love, Gary. And we're being genocided in our own country. Wouldn't you? Wouldn't you be bitter about it?
The irony of the story, Bobby Harper, the only black in Grant County, and his wife Cheryl lived directly behind Cobb.
Would you stay in the town if his supporters came in and started controlling the town?
Yes, I still would be there.
How come?
Because it's my home, and I have a right to be there.
Here's some Native Americans protesting Cobb. It was a total clusterfuck. Cobb made such an unholy ruckus, many white nationalists distanced themselves from him. In 2017, white nationalism seems to exist virtually on the borderless internet, where a millennial in London can opine on their American homeland as if they live there already.
For naturalized citizenship, in some cases. As for people who are citizens, who were born of citizens in the United States, I believe we need to incentivize them financially to move out of the United States.
That might be the end of it, but just this month Jared Taylor published a video where he mentions his Orania model again.
There is no reason why racially conscious whites could not do that. Of course, I know that you have argued that there would be a tremendous legal opposition to this, but I think it could be done in a legal way. It's just no one has taken the initiative.
Apart from pretending the Craig Cobb episode never happened, Taylor appears to have revised his grand white nationalist vision just a little bit.
I've thought about this perhaps once the people who work for me at American Renaissance put me out to pasture as a doddering no-good, I might sort of try to establish a community of that kind for superannuated white geezers.
I've had the same thought. In fact, I intend to set up sort of an old folks home and for aging people like us who can live safely. One of the problems, practical problems we're going to face in life for old racial actresses, being in a retirement home where the staff can look at you on the internet, and these are the people giving you your meds and your food.
Yes.
But I don't really think you can plan it, and the number of people who would move there would be too small, and you would have too many people that would be marginal people who would fall prey to agents provocateur.
Jared Taylor wanted a white nation, then he wanted a white hometown. Now he'll settle for a whites-only nursing home where he and his fellow white nationalists can spend their dotage waiting for their white heaven while the rest of us learn how to get along.